The cattle drive of the 1870s was not a journey of self-discovery or a pursuit of freedom. It was a massive, mobile extraction of value, an industrial-scale transfer of biological capital from the grasslands of Texas to the railheads of Kansas. When you see 3,000 head of longhorns stretching across the horizon, you aren't looking at nature. You are looking at a 3 million pound protein processing plant on the move. And the men tasked with driving that mass? They weren't the romantic icons of your childhood stories. They were biological gears in a high-friction machine, disposable components that were expected to grind themselves into the dirt to keep the capital moving. A cowboy in the late 19th century was a high-attrition, high-performance biological engine. This was a human being subjected to 14 hours of constant kinetic shock in a saddle, breathing the pulverized lung tissue of thousands of animals, and existing in a state of permanent sleep deprivation. To keep this engine from seizing up, the frontier didn't offer a menu. It offered a cold, mathematical administration of protein, lipids, and neurochemical stimulants. In 1866, Charles Goodnight looked at the vast, empty expanse of the Panhandle and realized that you cannot move capital across a desert without a mobile maintenance station. He took a surplus army wagon, reinforced the steel axles, and built the chuck box. This wasn't a kitchen. It was the logistical brain of the drive. Every tool, every gram of flour, and every drop of medicine was audited for its caloric utility. The man in charge of this hub, the cookie, was the most powerful biological gatekeeper on the trail. He wasn't a chef. He was an engineer of human output. He was usually a man whose own body had been broken by the trail, and he understood that his only job was to prevent a systemic hardware failure among the crew. He didn't care about the presentation of the plate. He cared about the total energy load of the crew. He was the only man who could tell the trail boss to go to hell, because he held the keys to the only thing that mattered: the fuel supply. The first requirement for a 4 a.m. start in a world without light is the artificial override of the human circadian rhythm. On the trail, exhaustion was a liability that the market couldn't afford. To bypass the brain's biological demand for rest, the frontier utilized a chemical weapon, Arbuckle's Ariosa. This wasn't brewed for its notes or its aroma. It was an industrial extraction process. The beans were coated in a glaze of egg white and sugar to seal in the oils, preventing the loss of potency during transport. The cowboys ground these beans by hand in a mill bolted to the side of the wagon, a rhythmic mechanical labor that began before the sun. They threw the grounds into a pot of alkaline river water and boiled it until it achieved the viscosity of crude oil. They called it six-shooter coffee. The legend was that if you dropped a lewd bullet into the pot and it sank, the coffee wasn't ready. You needed it thick enough to float a horseshoe. This wasn't a beverage, it was a neurological whip. The massive dose of caffeine was the only thing keeping the prefrontal cortex firing when the body had been in the saddle for 18 hours. You drank it hot enough to blister your throat, not because you enjoyed the heat, but because the physical pain was the only thing reminding you that you were still conscious. It was a liquid override for a nervous system on the brink of collapse. On the Great Plains, there is no grocery store, and yeast does not come in a packet. To provide the necessary carbohydrate chassis for the day's labor, every chuck wagon carried a sourdough starter, a living, volatile colony of bacteria kept in a wooden keg. This was the mother. It was a fermenting mass of flour and water that captured wild yeast from the air. The cookie treated this keg with a reverence that bordered on the religious. During the lethal frosts of the high plains nights, the cook would sleep with the keg inside his own bedroll. He wasn't being sentimental. He was keeping the bacteria alive. If the starter froze, the supply of pre-digested grain died. And if the bread died, the crew's biological battery followed shortly after. The sourdough was a biological hack. The fermentation process broke down the complex starches of the flour before it ever hit the cowboy's stomach, making the glucose available for immediate absorption into the bloodstream. They would take this fermented dough, drop it into a Dutch oven filled with boiling lard, and produce biscuits with the density of a lead sinker. It was a slow-release caloric brick. It sat in the gut for 8 hours, leaking energy into the system to prevent the hypoglycemic crashes that lead to a rider losing control of his mount during a midnight stampede. This was the fuel that powered the muscle, a constant, steady burn of grain and fat. Beef was the commodity, but it was also the fuel. However, you didn't kill a prime $5 per head steer just to feed a trailhand. That would be a catastrophic loss of profit. You ate the slippage, the animals that broke their legs in a prairie dog hole, or the calves born on the move that couldn't maintain the pace of the herd. When a calf was slaughtered, the Frontier's zero-waste policy went into effect. They called the result "son of a bitch stew," and it was a visceral map of the animal's internal anatomy. They didn't just use the muscle. Muscle was the least nutrient-dense part of the animal. They harvested the heart, the liver, the kidneys, and the marrow gut. The marrow gut was the secret to the biology of the trail. It was the upper part of the small intestine of a suckling calf, still filled with the digestive enzymes. When boiled, it released a rich, creamy, iron-scented sauce. This wasn't an aesthetic choice. It was a nutritional necessity. Cowboys, living on a diet of dry grain and salt-cured meat, were perpetually on the verge of systemic inflammation. The offal, the organs, provided the vitamin A, the B12, and the essential fatty acids. The stew was a thick, gray, steaming slurry of biological essentials. It tasted of iron, bile, and fat. It was the taste of the Frontier's brutal efficiency. You swallowed it fast, letting the visceral fats lubricate a body that was being ground into dust by the trail. The final factor in the cowboy's biological equation was the electrolyte balance. A man sweating under a 100-degree sun in a wool shirt loses 5 to 7 liters of fluid a day. Along with that fluid, he loses the salt and potassium required to keep his heart beating in a regular rhythm. To compensate, every piece of protein was aggressively salt-cured. Salt pork, salt beef, and salt-heavy lard. Every meal was a massive infusion of sodium designed to force the body to retain water, preventing the systemic dehydration that turns a man's blood into sludge. To balance this, they carried Arbuckle's peppermints, a rare burst of pure sucrose and glucose used for a quick hit of energy during the final, exhausting hours of the day. And then, there was the seasoning that no one asked for: the dust. The trail wasn't a road. It was a 1,000-mile cloud of pulverized limestone, dried manure, and mineral grit. It was in the air, it was in the water, and it was in the stew. You felt it between your teeth with every bite. This wasn't just an annoyance. It was a constant mineral load. You were literally eating the geography you were trying to conquer. The alkaline dust settled in the lungs and the stomach, neutralizing acids and changing the very chemistry of the body. We look at the chuck wagon through the lens of nostalgia. We see a rustic outdoor kitchen. I see a high-efficiency mobile maintenance station designed to keep a disposable labor force moving toward a market. The cookie didn't care about the cowboy's palate. He didn't care about his health. He cared about the output. If the crew's biological battery died, the cattle stopped moving. If the cattle stopped moving, the capital didn't grow. In the 1870s, the market was the only thing with a soul. The men were just the biological transport system, a collection of meat and bone used to move a more valuable collection of meat and bone across a wasteland. We've sanitized this history. We've turned it into barbecue and Western-themed restaurants. We've removed the bitterness of the boiled acid, the smell of the raw offal, and the grit of the alkaline dust. But the real frontier doesn't have a menu. It only has a ledger. And on the trail, you either provided enough energy to move the herd, or you were left in the dirt to be reclaimed by the minerals. The swinging doors of a Wild West saloon were never designed for dramatic entrances. They weren't a stage prop for a hero in a white hat to announce his arrival to a room full of hushed gamblers. That is the sanitized, perfumed version of history they sold you in the 1950s to make the conquest of the West look like a moral crusade. In reality, those bat-wing doors were a desperate necessity of fluid dynamics and biological survival. They were there for ventilation. Because once you crossed that threshold, the air was no longer a resource. It was a biohazard. It was a thick, stagnant suspension of ammonia, unwashed wool, stale tobacco, and the sweet, cloying scent of internal rot. The saloon was not a social club. It was a high-density infection vector. It was a terminal where the frontier's desperate labor force went to liquidate their wages in exchange for a chemical override of their miserable reality. It was the only place in town that stayed open 24 hours a day, not because of the community spirit, but because the biological machine of the frontier requires a pressure valve. And that valve was always, inevitably, coated in a thick layer of filth. The first thing you have to understand about the 1870s saloon is that it wasn't a building. It was an extraction point. In the early days of a mining camp or a railroad town, the saloon was the first organism to sprout from the mud. It didn't start with mahogany bars and crystal chandeliers. It started as a tent saloon, a canvas sheet stretched over a frame of scrap wood, sitting directly on the alkaline dust. If the town survived the first 6 months, the tent became a soddy, a structure built of earth and grass, literally a hole in the ground where men huddled together to drink in the dark. Only when the capital became stable did the false fronts go up. Those grand 2-story facades you see in movies? They were architectural lies. Behind those tall wooden walls was usually a cramped 1-story shack. It was a visual audit designed to trick the brain into believing there was stability where there was only chaos. It was a corporate mask worn by a shack to project an image of permanence in a world made of dust. The floor beneath your boots wasn't polished oak. It was rough-hewn pine, or more often, just packed dirt covered in a thick layer of sawdust. This wasn't for aesthetic charm. The sawdust was a visceral biofilter. Its job was to absorb the constant discharge of the human machine. Spilled beer, vomit, blood from a broken nose, and the incessant rhythmic stream of tobacco spit. By the end of a Saturday night, that floor was a damp, fermenting slurry of everything the human body rejects. You weren't standing in a bar. You were standing on a massive, porous sponge saturated with the pathogens of 1,000 unwashed men. This was the primordial mud of the frontier, a breeding ground for bacteria that thrived in the dark, damp heat of the room. If you ordered a whiskey in a frontier saloon, you weren't buying a drink. You were participating in a chemical assault. True, aged bourbon was a rare luxury, shipped in small quantities for the rail barons and the high-stakes gamblers who could afford the markup. For the man in the mud, the option was rot gut, coffin varnish, or tarantula juice. And those names weren't metaphors. They were clinical descriptions of the product's effect on the human nervous system and the gastrointestinal lining. The economics of the trail didn't allow for the transport of heavy glass bottles of premium spirits across 1,000 miles of desert. Instead, the saloon keeper would buy raw, industrial-grade grain alcohol, essentially 190-proof fire, and cut it on site. To make it look like whiskey, they added burnt sugar or molasses for color. To give it the kick of aged spirits, they added a plug of chewing tobacco for a nicotine hit that spiked the heart rate. But it went deeper into the visceral dark. To simulate the burn of high-quality liquor, they added red pepper. To make it more potent for a population that was already chemically dependent, they added turpentine, ammonia, and creosote, the same toxic chemical used to preserve railroad ties. In some cases, they added strychnine in microdoses. Strychnine, in small amounts, acts as a violent stimulant. It sharpens the senses and creates an intense, artificial high, followed by a crushing, agonizing withdrawal. This was the liquid fire that fueled the frontier. It was a neurotoxic cocktail designed to bypass the brain's survival instincts and replace them with a singular, desperate craving. When you drank it, your internal organs didn't just process it, they revolted against it. It was a liquid override for a nervous system that had been ground down by 16 hours of labor. You didn't drink for the notes of caramel. You drank for the chemical blackout that allowed you to forget the mud for a few hours. The saloon was a miracle of microbial efficiency. In a world before antibiotics, before germ theory was common knowledge on the plains, the interior of a crowded bar was a high-speed highway for contagion. Think about the logistics of the unwashed. A man on the frontier might bathe once a month, if the weather was warm enough to break the ice on the creek. He carried those pathogens, lice, staph, tuberculosis, directly into the closed, smoky environment of the saloon. The most lethal part of the experience was the communal glass. Saloons didn't have running water. They didn't have sanitizing cycles. A glass was cleaned by a quick dip in a bucket of stagnant river water behind the bar. Water that had already been used to rinse 100 other glasses that day. Every sip you took was a biological exchange with every man who had stood at that bar before you. This was the true Wild West violence. Cholera didn't need a six-shooter to clear a room. Smallpox didn't need a holster. Tuberculosis thrived in the kerosene smoke and the heavy dampness of the sawdust floors. In the 1870s, you had a 50% higher chance of being liquidated by a pathogen you inhaled over a hand of poker than you did of being shot in the street. The saloon was a massive wooden petri dish, and every patron was a fresh culture for the next epidemic. It was a site of biological mathematics, where the density of the crowd was directly proportional to the speed of the next outbreak. We like to think of the saloon as a lawless free-for-all, but it was actually a highly structured environment governed by a rigid ledger of exclusion. It was the frontier office, the central hub for the white male labor force, but the boundaries were carved in stone. It was a place for the white machine to reinforce its own biological hierarchy. A respectable woman wouldn't even walk on the same side of the street as a saloon. The air inside was considered morally and physically toxic. The only women allowed were the laborers, the saloon girls, whose job was to audit the pockets of the men. They weren't there for romance. They were there for resource extraction. They used the promise of companionship to keep the rot gut flowing, and ensuring that the workers' wages were recycled back into the saloon's treasury as quickly as possible. It was a high-stakes psychological game of survival. And then there were the racial lines. The frontier was a melting pot, but the saloon was a filter.
How much further do
Native Americans, Chinese immigrants, and black cowboys, who made up a huge portion of the labor force, were often barred by unwritten laws of biological hierarchy. They were forced to build their own shacks on the outskirts of town, peripheral saloons where the filth was even deeper and the liquor was even more lethal. The Main Street Saloon was a sanctuary for the dominant machine, a place where they could reinforce their standing while their livers slowly dissolved in a bath of turpentine and sugar. Forget the bar brawl. So the idea of 20 men throwing chairs and crashing through tables is a cinematic fantasy. In reality, a saloon brawl was a catastrophic loss of property that no saloon keeper would tolerate. If you broke a mirror or a chair, you were paying for it with your life or your wages. The cookie or the bartender was an enforcer of the market's assets. The violence in a real saloon was quick, quiet, and mechanical. It wasn't a fair fight. It was a sudden, visceral extraction. It happened over a marked card, a spilled drink, or a perceived audit of a man's honor. The saloon was the ultimate mirror of the frontier's soul. It wasn't a place of legends. It was a place of desperation. It was a site where the human machine went to recharge its batteries with poison and pathogens. We have sanitized it because the truth is too oily, too gritty, and too dark to put on a postcard. We've turned the rot gut into craft bourbon and the sawdust into rustic decor. We've removed the smell of the ammonia and the sound of the tubercular cough. We've turned a biological disaster zone into a theme park. We have replaced the primordial reality of survival with the comfort of nostalgia. But the real frontier doesn't care about your nostalgia. It only cares about the math. The saloon was the ledger where the price of the West was calculated in gallons of toxic spirit and years of lost life. It was a machine for turning men into waste, one drink at a time. And the floor was always ready for the next layer of sawdust to cover the evidence. You have seen the classic Hollywood shot 1,000 times. The rugged cowboy, exhausted from the trail, dismounts his horse, kneels by a crystal-clear, babbling mountain stream, and cups his hands. He drinks deeply, splashing the pristine, icy water over his face, a symbol of the untamed purity of the American West. It is a beautiful, cinematic lie. It is a fabricated delusion designed to sell you a romanticized version of a biological hellscape. If a pioneer on the Oregon Trail in 1850 dropped to his knees and drank from a river, he was not quenching his thirst. He was consuming a microscopic cocktail of human feces, rotting cattle flesh, and lethal bacteria. The rivers and streams of the frontier were not resources of life. They were open sewers. They were the most efficient delivery systems for mass death on the continent. In the 19th century, water was a biological weapon, and thirst was the ultimate mechanism of execution. Today, we are going to perform a visceral audit of frontier hydration. We are going to look at the exact chemical and biological reality of what happened when the human machine ran dry, and the horrifying, putrid liquids our ancestors were forced to swallow just to keep the engine running for one more day. History is never what you think. Before we look at the water, we must understand the terrifying mathematics of the void. We must understand dehydration. The human body is an engine that requires water as a coolant and a solvent. A pioneer walking beside a wagon in the Nebraska summer is operating in an environment of extreme thermal hostility. The temperature is 100 degrees. The air is dry, stripping moisture from the lungs with every exhalation. Under these conditions, a human being sweating through heavy wool clothing loses up to a liter of water per hour. This is where the biological math becomes a death sentence. When you lose just 5% of your body weight in water, the architecture of your system begins to buckle. Your blood volume drops. It physically thickens, turning from a fluid into a slow-moving, sticky sludge. Your heart has to beat violently, struggling to push this viscous mass through your vascular network. At 10% water loss, the metabolic default accelerates. Your kidneys, unable to flush the toxic byproducts of muscle exertion, begin to shut down. Cellular waste builds up in your bloodstream. Your salivary glands run completely dry. Your tongue swells, turning black and cracking like dried leather, filling your mouth with the taste of your own oxidized blood. At this stage, the prefrontal cortex, the part of your brain responsible for logic, reason, and disgust, is bypassed. The primordial brainstem takes over. The biological imperative to hydrate overrides every single psychological barrier you possess. You are no longer a civilized human being. You are a dying, desiccated organism, and you will drink absolutely anything to stop the cellular collapse. When the pioneer brain screamed for water, the most common source on the great migration routes was the Platte River. Over 500,000 people and millions of head of livestock walked the Oregon and California trails. They all followed the exact same path. They all camped by the exact same water. The trail was not a road. It was a 2,000-mile linear landfill. Think about the logistics of 500,000 humans and 2 million oxen, horses, and mules existing in a narrow corridor without a single piece of sanitation infrastructure. Where do the humans defecate? In the bushes near the river. Where do the exhausted, starving oxen die? They collapse in the mud on the riverbank, their massive, rotting bodies sliding directly into the water supply. The Platte River was famously described as too thick to drink and too thin to plow. It was a slow-moving, shallow ribbon of liquid mud, but it wasn't just dirt. When a pioneer dipped his tin cup into the Platte, he was skimming the biological runoff of every single wagon train that was miles ahead of him. He was scooping up a warm, brown necro broth. It was infused with the liquefied remains of dead livestock, the alkaline dust of the prairie, and the fresh, uncontainable diarrhea of the sick. There was no boiling protocol. There was no filtration. A father would scoop this thick, foul-smelling slime, wait 5 minutes for the heaviest mud to settle to the bottom of the cup, and hand it to his children. They drank it because the alternative was the agonizing desiccation of their internal organs. They traded immediate dehydration for a delayed microscopic assassination. The true apex predator of the American West did not have fur or fangs. It was invisible to the naked eye. It was Vibrio cholerae. Cholera was the grim reaper of the frontier waterways. We think of it today as an upset stomach, a relic of the past. In 1850, it was an unstoppable, biological override of the human gastrointestinal system. When a pioneer swallowed that cup of contaminated river water, the bacteria entered the stomach. If it survived the stomach acid, it moved into the small intestine, where it attached itself to the cellular walls and deployed a toxic payload. This toxin fundamentally hijacked the chemistry of the intestinal cells, forcing them to open their biological floodgates. The pioneer's body was rapidly draining its own fluid reserves into its gut. The result was an explosive, uncontrollable diarrhea known as rice water stool, a completely liquid excretion composed of pure water, electrolytes, and the sloughed-off lining of the victim's own intestines. The velocity of this disease is horrifying. A healthy, muscular man could wake up feeling perfectly fine, take a drink from a contaminated stream at noon, experience the first stomach cramps by 3 o'clock, and be a shriveled, dead corpse by midnight. A cholera victim can lose up to 20 liters of fluid in a single day. The dehydration is so rapid and so absolute that the victim's skin physically shrinks, pulling tightly over the skull to create a living skeleton. Because the blood volume collapses, the skin turns a ghastly, bruising blue, a condition called cyanosis. The muscles, stripped of sodium and potassium, knot into excruciating, violent cramps that can tear the muscle fibers from the bone. And the most terrifying part? Cholera does not cross the blood-brain barrier. The victim remains entirely conscious, entirely lucid, trapped inside a rapidly shrinking, agonizing body, watching their own biology liquidate itself. When they died, they were buried in shallow graves right next to the trail. When it rained, the bacteria from their corpses washed directly back into the river, perfectly reloading the biological weapon for the next wagon train. It was an immaculate, closed-loop system of mass death. If you managed to evade cholera, the water held other, slower methods of torture. Dysentery, caused by Shigella bacteria or amoebas, was a constant companion on the trail. While cholera killed you with fluid loss, dysentery killed you by ulcerating your internal plumbing. The bacteria invaded the lining of the large intestine, causing intense inflammation, bleeding, and necrosis. The victim would suffer from agonizing cramps and bloody, mucus-filled diarrhea, slowly bleeding out internally while wasting away from an inability to absorb nutrients. And if you ventured into the pristine mountains, away from the muddy plains, you encountered a different deception. You might find a crystal-clear, icy mountain stream. It looks pure, it tastes perfect. But it is the home of Giardia lamblia, a microscopic parasite deposited by the feces of beavers and wild animals. They called it beaver fever. Once ingested, the parasite cysts hatch in your gut, attaching themselves to the walls of your intestines like millions of tiny suction cups. They block the absorption of fats and nutrients, resulting in weeks of sulfurous belching, severe bloating, and chronic, greasy diarrhea. You could drink the most beautiful water in the Rocky Mountains and still end up a hollowed-out, starving shell. What happens when there is no river? What happens when the trail crosses the high deserts of Wyoming or Nevada? The biological math demands water, and the human machine will resort to horrifying extremes to satisfy the ledger. When the rivers dried up, the pioneers relied on wagon ruts. Imagine a deep groove carved into the mud by the iron wheels of 1,000 wagons. A brief rainstorm fills this rut with an inch of tepid water. Over the next week, it bakes in the sun. It becomes a stagnant incubator. Mosquitoes lay their eggs. Flies deposit larvae. When a pioneer family reached this rut, they were often in the final stages of dehydration. They didn't see a puddle of maggots. They saw salvation. They wrote of clenching their teeth together as they drank, using their own teeth as a crude biological filter to strain out the wriggling maggots. They swallowed the slime, praying it would stay down long enough to hydrate their blood. But the most deceptive and lethal waters were the alkali pools. The water in these pools might look crystal clear, but it was highly caustic. Animals driven mad by thirst would sprint toward these pools, plunge their snouts in, and drink deeply. The heavily alkaline water would instantly react with the acids in their stomachs, causing violent, explosive bloating. A perfectly healthy ox could drink from an alkali pool and drop dead in its tracks within 10 minutes, its internal organs chemically burned and ruptured. Humans who drank it experienced immediate, searing pain in their throats. It was a liquid mirage, water that dehydrated you faster than the sun. To survive, pioneers learned to mix vinegar or citric acid into the water, desperately trying to neutralize the base chemistry of the poison before they swallowed it. If the water was a biological minefield, how did anyone survive the West? The answer lies in two chemical hacks, one intentional and one accidental: whiskey and coffee. Whiskey was biologically safe, but alcohol is a diuretic. It forces your kidneys to expel water. You cannot hydrate a working cowboy with whiskey. You will only accelerate his metabolic collapse. The true savior of the American West was coffee. The pioneers did not understand germ theory. They did not know what a bacteria was, but they knew that if they drank the water straight from the Platte River, they died. If they drank coffee, they lived. They thought it was the medicinal properties of the coffee bean. In reality, it was the thermodynamics of the campfire. To make coffee, you have to boil the water. The rolling boil ruptured the cell walls of the Vibrio cholerae and the Shigella bacteria. The fire sterilized the necro broth. Furthermore, the dark, bitter, heavily roasted Arbuckle's coffee beans were exceptionally good at masking the foul, metallic taste of the alkaline dust and the subtle, sickening flavor of rotting organic matter. Coffee wasn't a morning pick-me-up. It was a decontamination protocol. The cowboy didn't drink coffee because he liked the taste. He drank it because his subconscious realized it was the only liquid that wouldn't result in his bowels liquefying before sunset. We turn on a stainless steel tap, and a limitless supply of perfectly clear, chemically treated, UV sterilized water flows into our glasses. We complain if it tastes faintly of chlorine. We complain if it isn't cold enough. We have completely decoupled ourselves from the visceral reality of the human machine. We have forgotten that for 99% of human history, water was not a right. It was a gamble. It was a predatory force that hid microscopic armies of destruction behind a shimmering, reflective surface. The Wild West was not conquered by the six-shooter, the telegraph, or the railroad. It was a war of biological attrition. It was a ledger where the cost of expansion was paid in liters of bodily fluid, expelled in agony by the side of a dusty trail. Civilization is not defined by art or law or architecture. Civilization is a water treatment plant. It is the invisible infrastructure that stands between your internal organs and the rotting, microscopic chaos of the natural world. When you strip away the Hollywood romance, you are left with the brutal, chemical mathematics of the frontier. You are left with a man on his knees, filtering maggots through his teeth, swallowing the liquid remains of the dead, just to buy his cells one more hour of function in the unforgiving sun. You have seen the scene 1,000 times. The weary, dust-covered cowboy pushes through the swinging doors, tosses a heavy silver dollar to the barkeep, and nods toward the stairs. He walks up to a private room, closes a solid wooden door behind him, pulls off his boots, and falls into a plush, solitary bed to sleep the deep, peaceful sleep of the righteous frontier hero. It is a cinematic hallucination. It is a sterilized, perfumed fairy tale designed to protect your modern sensibilities from the visceral, suffocating horror of 19th century logistics. If you were a laborer on the frontier, a cowboy, a miner, a transient worker, and you paid for a night's rest in a saloon or a boarding house, you were not buying privacy. Privacy was a luxury reserved for the railroad barons and the politicians. You were buying a temporary lease on a high-density biological nightmare. You were paying to insert your exhausted, vulnerable body into a rotting, parasitic ecosystem where sleep was not a restorative process, but a dangerous, chemically toxic state of unconsciousness. Today, we are going to perform a visceral audit of a frontier night. We are going to calculate the exact physiological and psychological toll of lying down in the dark of the Wild West, and why your modern, sanitized nervous system would completely shatter before sunrise. History is never what you think. To understand the horror of frontier sleep, you must first understand the brutal economics of frontier space. In a boomtown, whether it was driven by gold, silver, or cattle, every square inch of lumber under a roof was an asset that had to generate maximum capital. A saloon keeper did not build empty space for your comfort. When you paid your 25 cents for a bed, you were not renting a room. You were not even renting the whole bed. You were renting a horizontal sliver of a mattress. The concept of the shared bed was the undisputed law of the frontier. Imagine it. You have been in the saddle for 18 hours. You are covered in alkaline dust, horse sweat, and your own dried bodily fluids. You drag yourself upstairs into a low-ceilinged, unventilated loft. Inside, there are 6 beds crammed end to end. And in the bed you have been assigned, there are already 3 other men. These are not your friends. They are strangers. They are teamsters, buffalo hunters, and drifters. They haven't bathed in 6 months, and you must crawl into the exact same blankets, pressing your exhausted body against theirs. The biological math is horrifying. 4 adult male bodies, each radiating 98.6 degrees of heat, trapped in a confined space with 0 air circulation. The bed becomes a literal human furnace. You are breathing the expelled carbon dioxide, the tubercular coughs, and the humid, fermented breath of men who have been drinking raw grain alcohol all day. You are not resting. You are marinating in the collective biological exhaust of the frontier labor force. Let us examine the surface upon which you are attempting to rest. The Hollywood mattress is white cotton and fresh feathers. The reality of the 1870s saloon mattress was a localized environmental disaster. These beds were typically crude canvas sacks stuffed with prairie grass, straw, or, if you were in a high-end establishment, horsehair. But this stuffing was almost never changed. Over months and years, the straw broke down under the weight of thousands of heavy men. It pulverized into a fine, highly allergenic dust. But it was what bound that dust together that constitutes the true horror. The frontier mattress was a massive, highly absorbent biological sponge. Every man who slept on it deposited a layer of his own physical decay. They sweat out the toxins of cheap whiskey and fever. They bled from trail wounds, bar fights, and burst ulcers. They vomited. They shed millions of dead skin cells. They wept pus from untreated syphilitic sores and gangrenous cuts. Because the sheets, if there were sheets at all, were washed perhaps once a season in a bucket of cold, dirty water. The fluids seeped directly into the canvas and the straw. The mattress became a dense, hardened slab of historical human waste. It was a geological core sample of the town's diseases. When you lay down, the warmth of your body reheated this ancient fermented layer of bodily fluids, causing it to off-gas a sickening, sweet, necrotic odor directly into your face. You were literally sleeping on the liquefied ghosts of the men who had occupied that space before you. As you lie there, pinned between the sweating bodies of unwashed strangers, suffocating on the smell of the mattress, the true masters of the saloon begin their work. You were not at the top of the food chain in this room. You were the buffet. The frontier boarding house was an insectoid utopia. The lack of hygiene, the constant influx of new, unwashed hosts, and the dense, dark crevices of the crude wooden bed frames created the perfect breeding ground for millions of parasites. First came the lice. Body lice and head lice thrived in the heavy, unwashed wool clothing that the men never took off. As you pressed against your bedmates, the lice migrated, finding fresh territory in your hair and the seams of your garments. They bit, they crawled, and they carried the Rickettsia bacteria, the pathogen responsible for epidemic typhus, a disease that caused a skyrocketing fever, a rotting rash, and a horrific, agonizing death. But the lice were just the infantry. The heavy artillery were the bedbugs. The bedbug, Cimex lectularius, is an evolutionary masterpiece of nocturnal torture. They hid by the thousands in the cracks of the walls and the seams of the rotting mattresses. They are attracted by the carbon dioxide you exhale and the thermal signature of your body. In the dead of night, they emerged in swarms. A bedbug does not just bite, it performs a microscopic surgical procedure. It injects an anticoagulant to keep your blood flowing, paired with a mild anesthetic so you don't feel the initial puncture. It feeds until it is engorged, swelling to 3 times its size with your blood, and then it retreats. You do not wake up from the bite. You wake up from the aftermath. Once the anesthetic wears off, the human immune system reacts to the insect's saliva. You awaken in the pitch black, your skin burning with a manic, unscratchable itch. You are covered in raised red welts. And when you finally manage to strike a match, you see the horrifying reality. The sheets are smeared with hundreds of tiny, rusty red streaks, the crushed bodies of the bugs and your own stolen blood. If your modern mind could somehow process the crowding, the biohazardous mattress, and the parasitic swarm, your nervous system would finally be shattered by the absolute uncompromising chemistry of the air. Our modern olfactory sensors are fragile. We live in a world of deodorants, HEPA filters, and exhaust fans. The air inside a frontier saloon's sleeping quarters was a toxic, combustible mixture of volatile, organic compounds. Let's break down the ledger of the stench. First, the butyric acid. This is the chemical compound found in rancid butter and human sweat. Men who wore the same thick wool socks and heavy leather boots for months at a time produced this acid in industrial quantities. When 4 dozen men took their boots off in a closed room, the sheer concentration of butyric acid was enough to cause your eyes to water and your throat to close. Second, the sulfur. Dental hygiene did not exist. Men suffered from advanced periodontal disease, rotting roots, and abscesses. With every exhalation, they pumped hydrogen sulfide and methyl mercaptan into the air, the exact chemical compounds responsible for the smell of rotting eggs and decaying meat. Finally, the ammonia. There was no indoor plumbing. If a man needed to relieve himself in the middle of the night, he did not walk outside into the freezing mud or the dangerous dark. He used the chamber pot in the corner of the room. By 2 a.m., that pot was overflowing with the urine and diarrhea of heavily intoxicated, dysentery-stricken men. The ammonia from the degrading urine evaporated into the heavy, stagnant air, literally burning the mucous membranes inside your nose and lungs. You were not breathing oxygen. You were breathing a thick, humid, suffocating fog of human rot. Let us assume the impossible. Let us assume that sheer biological exhaustion overrides the heat, the stench, the lice, and the bedbugs. You close your eyes. Your brain begins the descent into REM sleep. This is the moment you are in the greatest danger. Because the final horror of the frontier night was the man lying next to you. The Wild West was a landscape of extreme resource scarcity. In this environment, human life was cheap, But manufactured goods were incredibly expensive, and nothing was more valuable, more necessary for biological survival than a good pair of leather boots. If you were a drifter crossing the plains and your boots fell apart, you were dead. The alkaline dust, the rocks, and the rattlesnakes would destroy your feet, rendering you immobile. And on the frontier, immobility is a death sentence. Therefore, a pair of intact, well-made boots was worth exponentially more than the life of the stranger wearing them. You did not take your boots off to sleep. That is a Hollywood myth. If you took your boots off and placed them neatly by the bed, you would wake up barefoot, bankrupt, and doomed. You slept with your boots on your feet. But even that was not enough. The men sharing your bed, or the men sleeping on the floor nearby, were operating under a ruthless, psychopathic survival metric. If they were desperate, your sleeping, unconscious form was nothing more than an obstacle between them and the resources they needed to survive. Throats were slit in the dark for a silver watch, a decent revolver, or a sturdy pair of boots. The noise of the saloon downstairs, the piano, the shouting, the breaking glass, provided the perfect acoustic cover for murder. A man could drive a 6-inch blade into your carotid artery, wait for you to bleed out into the already blood-soaked straw mattress, strip you of your valuables, and be gone out the window before the sun came up. This is why the true veterans of the frontier did not sleep deeply. They practiced a form of highly anxious, fractured resting. They slept with their gun in their hand, hidden under the filthy blanket, their finger resting gently on the trigger guard. They trained their nervous systems to snap from unconsciousness to lethal violence at the slightest shift in the weight of the mattress or the sudden stopping of a stranger's snoring. Sleep was not a sanctuary. It was a tactical vulnerability. We look back at the frontier and romanticize the freedom of the open range. We envy the simplicity of a life without clocks, without cubicles, without the hum of modern anxiety. We are fools. We are soft, sanitized creatures who have forgotten the brutal mathematical reality of the human machine. To survive a night in a Wild West saloon required a physiological resilience that we no longer possess. It required a stomach that could process rot, a respiratory system that could filter toxic ammonia, an immune system that could wage constant war against typhus-carrying parasites, and a psyche cold enough to sleep next to a murderer while keeping your hand on a loaded gun. The frontier did not offer rest. It only offered a temporary pause in the labor, a dark, suffocating holding cell where your body was slowly consumed by the environment until the sun rose and the work began again. You think you could have survived it. You think you would have been the hero in the private room. But the ledger of history has no private rooms. It only has the shared, blood-stained straw of the floor and the hungry dark waiting for you to close your eyes. My name is Nathaniel Blackwood, and history is never what you think.